Gino Gabia says, B is the answer pa.
Gino Gabia said hi. BJ6ING6 says, yo it's C. Blackview Gamer says, C because the woman's skeleton has a wider hip for giving birth easier. BJ6ING6 says, I'm not even lying. Willow FC18 says, CC. Advic Dienga C8Q9D says, CC. Willow FC18 says, CC. Giant Ram Nanan says, or. Sam Benjamin says, you are. Isabel Nida 3N says, it is C. BJ6RNG6 says, look at CS face. Giant Ram Nanan says, or. Giant Ram Nanan says, or. Sam Benjamin says, 67. Galia Alkulani says, CCC. It's TIZAGRY says, C because pelvis is bigger. Andy Panksy says, I think it's C. Sam Benjamin says, Vera Valea. BJ6RNG6 says, CCC. Sam Benjamin says, Thumara Naankia. Emmanuel Michaela Contacto says, CC. Edith Wiridadagandmi says, I think CC. Nashlia Mafatuno said hi. BJ6ING6 says, can't believe C. Maya says, BVFGFGG. Iyahaya says, it's C the pelvis. Iyahaya says, it's larger. Nashlia Mafatuno says, CC. Antifarakid said hi. Alia0NZ says, CS pelvis is the same size as A. Maya says, ISY. Riptide Edit says, she said Nikar. Parasitic Semper 17 says, B, she was beaten by A. Gino Gabia says, B it's because letter B has wider pelvis, and a larger subpublic angle. Hey Blanket 1 says, why maybe she is tall. Alia0NZ says, yes it's B. Seth3ZZ says, it's C. Silly Pants 64 says, Nika. King Zen says, 67. Silly Pants 64 says, it's C. Alien Yang says, it's C. Singer-songwriter Void says, or. It's Kira says, I don't know C. Maya says, I see you. Electrodynamics says, what? Tony says, A because she's crashed the car again. Junkbot Malaysian says, hi. Amish says, welcome to chat at junkbot_Malaysian 123 welcome. Maya says, I see you. Amo says, it's BB. Amo says, it's B. Seth3ZZ says, it be never mind. Amo says, it's B. Zatrix12 says, C. Seth3ZZ says, it's B never mind. Elon Gaming WJ for SB says, it's B. Coleblocksophical YT says, hi Nightbot. Seth3ZZ says, it's B never mind. Seth3ZZ says, it's B never mind. Seth3ZZ says, it's B. Natox6902Z says, it is C. 0BV1 Bluey says, hello. BOOP Dupe says, I don't fucking care, leave my feed alone. Cassadelacy W2I says, I think it's C. Coleblocksophical YT says, it's B. Seth3ZZ says, it's BB. Seth3ZZ says, it's BB. LionFF says, hi. Amish says, welcome to chat at LionFF_246 welcome.
GB subscribed.
Natox6902Z says, it's B. Bokang Faswana says, good. 0BV1 Bluey says, it's B. Lily Lovebraids S6Q said hi. K906P5 says, they all men's skeletons, this RE is trash. IDK1212Y8F says, it's BB. GBFQ1BW says, really Hashira1, face red droopy eyes. Coleblocksophical YT says, BB. Gioine says, I don't know. 1 year Helena says, I think it's pneumonia. Sisant Gamer says, BB. Ditshego Fatso Mapulane says, it's more like B. Sal says, it's A. Bokang Faswana says, Bokang. Amo says, IGTG. McKinley Dye says, it is A. Cassadelacy W2I says, I think it's C bro. Emma Vandervelde says, C of B. Widja Stevens says, AB. Razia Cyrif says, or. Minititan N7M says, I don't know. Coleblocksophical YT says, BB. 1 year Helena says, it's B. Galaxy Bacanophical says, hi. Bellacutolol R8C says, blue. Sophia Sheck Pretty says, is C. Galaxy Bacanophical says, hello Manish. Coleblocksophical YT says, hi Nightbot. Seth3ZZ says, it's B. Seth3ZZ says, it's BB. Roach9 says, shut up. Seth3ZZ says, it's BB. Sophia Sheck Pretty says, laugh. Minititan N7M says, does this support #CK? IDK1212Y8F says, also go away. Dima Ul-Rajab says, shut down. MY says, hi. Anish says, welcome to chat at MY0423 welcome. Orange Corey 22W1 says, it's B losers everyone watching this is dumb. Kazutere says, laughing out loud. Leland Carter says, hello. Anish says, welcome to chat at Leland Carter welcome. Orange Corey 22W1 says, your needs. Orange Corey 22W1 says, your loser dumps its B. Jessica says, C. Household Microwave says, it's C. Gino Gabia says, it's BB. Jessica says, hi. Leland Parter says, what's up? Rehammed Gamer said hi. Mitch Govito says, CC. Mitch Govito said hi. Leland Parter says, BB. Joe Nathan Mercado says, it's C. Giovanna Palope says, C. Joe Nathan Mercado says, hi. Anish says, welcome to chat at Joe Nathan Mercado welcome. Hijab Fashion MS says, I think it's C. Lily Antelek says, or. Caleb Carpenter OS3MH says, I think it's B. Lily Antelek says, or. Lily Antelek says, or. Caitlin Silligan says, as. Caitlin Silligan says, AA. Green Game Boy says, 67. Tornado 206Z says, ANC. Joe Nathan Mercado says, it's C. PLZCHQN says, it's C because women need a wider pelvis in order to give birth. Caitlin Silligan says, AAA. European Aviation F3F says, hello. Anish says, welcome to chat at European_Aviation F3F welcome. Giovanna Palope says, C. GNG. Farah Gallegos says, C. Hornet Dude Haha says, it's C. Amy Cornejo E5 says, it's goo, I mean C. Jovin Jimenez S3L says, B or C. Najat Gina says, who knows? Rizzy Otter says, C Otter. Eldaptitry says,
Justin
it's D.
Ondachi subscribed.
Gimmick Subscription says, I think it's A. Moon Icon 25 says, C, because the hip is wide for giving birth. Alita Katakutan says, CC. Gavin Kaksana says, C brochacho. Shu Porang Linos 143C says, it's C because of the pelvis. Jason Bellamangilapnan says, Yui. Gimmick Subscription says, please speed, I need this. Gimmick Subscription says, my mom is kinda homeless. Jared Austin Lassay says, go away. Lava Legend B Double says, hi. Gimmick Subscription says, who the hell just sweat? Fubby Juice KF said hi. Hornet Dude Haha says, whoever saying it is stupid. Gimmick Subscription says, Nightbot, what is your role? Rumalib2 says, hi. Gavin Kaksana says, hello. Anish says, welcome to chat at Gavin Kaksana 6991 welcome. Rumalib2 says, I think it's C. Household Microwave says, why? Hornet Dude Haha says, it's C. Hornet Dude Haha says, it's C. Shani Matthew says, you're. Tim says, it's neither of the skeletons. Claude George says, it's B. Lane Big says, B women are never happen. That 11 pack 1D says, how is this C? Istanskslur says, I farted. Cricket and 33p said hi. Gimmick Subscription says, you. Gimmick Subscription says, we didn't need to know. Hornet Dude Haha says, whoever saying it so is stupid. Kristen Terrier says, how is it C? Gimmick Subscription says, face red droopy eyes, face red droopy eyes, face red droopy eyes, face red droopy eyes, face red droopy eyes. ArcG8K says, I have a plan. Gabrielle Garcia says, I think it's C. 7 Markham 7 Amma says, a man be woman C kid. Seth 3ZZ says, brew. Rylan Kale Rondero says, hello I'm Peer. Vini MM2 says, poop. Bugabop says, C, the pelvis. Theactualga Maspo says, sad. Fraser Place says, CVIP. They killed Kenny says, GER. Gimmick Subscription says, if you think it's A or B you are so dumb. Mr. Hello U1H says, CC. Axel Sampan says, depends on the pelvis. Fraser Place says, C. Fisheye MQ29 said hi. Daniel Yola B4B says, BA. Hornet Dude Haha says, CC Lemony Squeezy. Minispro Edit says, it's C. Dandadan says, I don't know what I'm saying. Rebecca Official said hi. R63.
Dog Lover subscribed.
Hannah Trimble B9 says, what is VIP viewer?
Ashblade
Ada Bauman 29L
127th
says,
subscribed.
I think it's a.
Zaki Lou
Yugsgame
subscribed.
says, IT is a. Res CC says, hi. Anish says, welcome to chat at REUS_CC welcome. James Spainadaf 80 says, CC is the correct. Vanny Wally Whitey says, meow. Rylan Kale Rondero says, pear. Daniel Yola B4B says, meowing. Capricorn Estov says, female usually have either smaller torso or big thigh. Amar7S says, it's either A or C. Ormi Amagadia says, hi. Mr. Reed Official says, my grandma got hit by a bazooka. Kabikada Cyclist says, this is an easy question I think because women are a bit smaller than men. Rylan Kale Rondero says, Skelly. Ormi Amagadia says, hi. Amalamilia says, yeah it's C. Mr. Reed Official says, my grandma got hit by a bazooka. Bismilba says, I'm C. Yazuri W3M says, it's A. Ormi Amagadia says, it's C. Bubble11 says, C is a woman. Lizzie2B says, it's C. Ashley Roblox says, the happy one. Cairo Sterling says, sundress. Jammer Plus Luna says, I start myself. For says, it's BB. Brew Moment says, who farted? Jason Bun V9J says, which one is it? Namka Fatum Laden says, 2. Asharf Angel says, I need help. Bismilba says, it's C. Asharf Angel says, hi. Asharf Angel says, hi. GeoX7K says, rest in peace my granny, she got hit by a bazooka. Hornet Dude haha says, it's C. Asharf Angel says, hi. Brady01H1Q says, hoodies. Bismilba says, guys it's C. Blaze Musician says, 67. Anish Lolo says, double tap screen, face red heart shape, face red heart shape. Ron James Morel Ibabao says, none. Anxietilolea says, ha ha. Yuti Mac Yuti says,
Stephen
yo.
Hudgens subscribed.
Tuanu Alicia Binta Chuan FK9 says,
Blaze
said
VR
hi.
subscribed.
Yuti Mac Yuti says, yo.
Bra_moment subscribed.
Ivy Olivia Beast says, I think it's definitely A, B or C.
Jesus Loves IU224 subscribed.
Said hi. TechShoes U5G says, hello. Just someone says, subscribe. Bismilba says, Anna0011K4S says, it's the idiots. Just someone says, hi sup. Aussie Akutaga Youngall says, B Rosie. King Stevenson U8C says, I love you. Det Half Destiny says, it's C. Roy Lopez says, CCCR7. Moonshow Mel 6F says, they're both women, neither of them have testicles. Ilova Benito Papi says, B or C cause not every woman is short. As Marbint says, it's C. The real CV12 says, fake stream. The real CV12 says, fake stream. Joseph Louis Viscano says, AHH. Georgia Caraballo says, it is A. Angry Red Boko says, none of them. Ani RT5T says, brew. Blinky Girly Official says, I don't know. Adeline Faith Chen says, Daf A. Janat Nawim says, hi. Boitwa says, women have wider hips due row evolution. Omni General Munchkinman says, hi. Alicorny always says, HLO. Ivy Olivia B says, it's definitely C. Kalate Kamako says, see look at tight body why she said she hit by bazooka with a grandma. It's Scaralov says, they're all women, they have uteruses. Ivy Olivia B says, it has B. Dhruv Maxa says, rest in peach my granny. Ivy Olivia B says, it has to be C. Wanyanti says, bro pick me please. Ivy Olivia B says, it's C. Wawawa says, poop. Kittysoft Lola says, CC. Kittysoft Lola says, face red droopy eyes, face red droopy eyes, face red droopy eyes. Laser Pamplona says, face purple wide eyes, face blue covering eyes, body blue raised arms, greatest of all time turquoise white horns, face orange raised eyebrow, hand purple blue piece.
Subscribed.
Ivy Olivia B says, it's definitely C. Radia Hee says, my mom fell down the stairs. Uriah JY1L says, Tally Hall is awesome. Amanda DeMusio says, CCC. Charlie L2P1 ton says, hi. Mason Caldwell says, 676767. Zorubai Jude says, boo. Stick Figures Cutichin says, it's C dude. Zenaida L3T says, 67. Latonia Daniels says, thank you. Radia Hee says, my mom fell down the stairs. Latonia Daniels says, ZX. Latonia Daniels says XX. Master Japanese Goro Miguel says, ha. Najigo Joguza says, it's C. Radia Hee says, I pooped myself. Vini MM2 says, everyone say yes in chat if you are alive and not a skeleton. Sex Sharon says, hey. Radia Hee says, dude just mention my damn comment, sad smiley. Don't Cry says, hello. Landon NB4OS says, rest in peace my granny, she got hit by a bazooka. Oscalopus P1Z says, none since the pelvic bone is not any bigger than the last but H2. Nova Whitey Pixel Blade says, it's the letter C because the body is smaller which makes the skeleton smaller. Zariko says, it's B so easy. Annabelle Mitchell S9B1B says, mention my comment please. Nana Vasage says, CR7. Bookgirl says, brew. Zariko says, oh my god use your brains PPL. 0NXM0 says, it's B. Starlight 138C4J says, for real. T-School 123LV2S7G says, it's H. Cake Surprise says, or. Kristen Marwell Polga says, hi. Longling says, A because woman's is scary. Starlight 138C4J says, I don't know. Zoe TSE says, is all. Jennifer Castanos K8M says, 67. Francis Vicente U4I says, Kabam Kablor. Zoe TSE says, is A, B and C. Zoe TSE says, is A, B and C. Caleb X9D5 says, the pelvis is wider on a so it is A. Featherbruff says, CC. Via VR says, 44 Niel says, hi am I amigo. T-School 123LV2S7G says, it's 5. Cheese Kitty says, oh I. Gananayaka Jalira Balaga 5Y says, bazooka. Nazaliza says, BBBHPLSS me. Moonlight Child says, see come on. Melba Loyola says, hi. Gananayaka Jalira Balaga 5Y says, judge. Torbit says, would. Cecilia Official Channel says, it's C. Tunil says, Dove with 7 skig. Beckham says, said hi. Clenty Official says, I think it's C. Dan Lawrence says, any of them. Holla Mustafa D5T says, hello. Fayanjithianji says, it's AB. T-School 123LV2S7G says, it's 5. My cats are lovely AF says, it's C goddamn. Holla Mustafa D5T says, 6777. Starlight 138C4J says, it's C. Ayala Veskapcot says, hello how are you? Fayanjithianji says, it's AB. Marisol Infante X8R1 says, rest in peace my granny you got it by a bazooka. Almand Katz Alma says, guys, women's pelvic bones tend to be wider to make childbirth easier and have less complications. Little Miss SIA says, Anam. Johanna Dreff says, Anilop. Matthew Ventura Wilson says, please show me out, Alejandra. Silly Dogi says, me I'm a woman. Athlete Sokshi says, C is the correct answer. Jahanadref says, 2007. Jahanadref says, C7. Jahanadref says, 67. Vero Fantor W says, Skibidi Rizzo Hio it's B. Ilo Vescapcot says, what I'm VIP viewer. Tar LD9L says, no it's C. Soggiest Sock says, C has a bigger pelvis and is small.
Lucas Carvalho subscribed.
Brucey and Lunafall Life says, it's C because of the shoulders.
Radioactive emoji,
Hernandez says, what the
4,556
Sigma?
subscribed. Radulus Kudan
Antonai
subscribed.
Takalompang says, CC. Kitty
Clint
Comedy
Toy
says,
Official
how should we
subscribed.
know they're both sane? Reagan says, das FX. Daniel Yona B4B said hi. Fabi Hernandez says, what the Sigma? Strawberries Cupcake said Q3NC says, a B. Good Deeds Boriti says, C is Kevin Hart. Purabi Hazarika says, Guguji55. Take it, Hugs and Kisses says, I love your AI voice, it's so cute though. Curious George 1 says, Daff not the black skins. Police Robot 26 says, Pow Pow DF. Eva Chigwidden says, it's C bro you bum bum 67. 2DXD says, or. Eva Chigwidden says, CC. Daniel Yona B4B says, my sister hit by a bazooka.
Is a pro
Alinza
subscribed.
Taroff says, B or C. Kristen
Hyla
Aturanti
Isabel
says,
Trent
it's C.
subscribed.
Fabi Hernandez says, what the Sigma?
Judy and Alon subscribed.
Iman M fully says, hi reply me. Glistable Chicken Gun says, this is so shitty BHH. Farsia Whitey said hi. Moma Luca Krell says, hi. Juan Antonio Flores Galindo H says, XD. Earcrogs 49 says, see the frame is smaller, wider hips and wider ribcage. Canis K00L says, I'll subscribe. Rebecca Lighthill says, B. 2DXD says, or. 0 Deadly 0mm 2 says, C, B, and I have wider shoulders. Eva 12L1J says, I looked somewhere I shouldn't be. Khan says, I think it is C. Moma Luca Krell says, I think it is C. Iman M fully says, hi. Francis Mariana says, hi. Iman M fully says, it's C. Rip Shadowplay says, it's. Rick Vic 18 says, read my comment. Iconic Icon Unchip says, it's C all. 0 Deadly 0mm 2 says, C, because AB have wider shoulders. Mtahan Ranarain says, Puddy I don't think. 2DXD says, guys I think it's all. Mama Inda R3F says, hand pink waving, hand pink waving, hand pink waving. Sherman Nekasi says, is she already mad? Nadia Kazilowicz says, it's B. Johanna Dreff says, I'm from Philippines. Pura Bihazarika says, Vinny Beauty Jif the hour. 2DXD says, guys I think it's all. Zeno Prash 7 says, this shit is fake. Offroad King 1005 says, A is of course Diddy. 0 Deadly 0mm 2 says, rest in peace my granny, she got hit by a bazooka. Yeah, I think about every time I hit the hookah. Sigma Master 3000Y6G says, I love your mom. Johanna Dreff said hi. Nicola Browner 1C says, it's B. Pancake Spectre U5V says, hi B. Tenica Vanjifan says, 6, 7. May Elisa Potter says, skis diddy. Harrison Logu says, it is C, good pelvis. 0 Deadly 0mm 2 says, you. Khan says, C is correct because of skull and shoulder. Rajni Rani says, VO. Dummy Cat D3U says, the one with no brain. Dummy Cat D3U says, that one. Christoph says, CC. 2DXD says, HI. Bruno Asadog 15 says, Kain Burger. Is Apre says, Uwu. Khan says, 67676767. It's Menu 5RW says, they're all women's. Dude GT Blue says, C has a wider pelvis. Is Apro says, Skibidi. Johanna Dreff says, 6 CBN, 67. P4 Strike F says, well, every human has got equally same skeleton, so I'll try to not complain how stupid the question is. Jacris Bogayan said hi. Is Apro says, uwu. Brevayam Lanjeni S. Fubi said hi. Sherab Kuandan Wangchuk says, rest in peace my granny got hit by Baz. Faris Kamari says, what the fucking hell? Nicola Browner 1C says, hi. Abdul Rahman M3T7W says, 67. LTNZ says, bellow. It's just a says, I don't know. Ibrahim Qureshi L1W says, 67. Abdul Rahman M3T7W says, GAA. Abdul Rahman M3T7W says, PLH. Don Rowley says, no. Becky Martin 6 says, he. Don Rowley says, I'm eating caramel. Sherab Kuandan Wangchuk says, rest in peace my granny, she hit by a bazooka. Is Apro says, put to me an eye thingy. Gamerskit says, bro I clicked B instead of C. Is Apro says, bro Diddy. Abdel Hadi Ahmed 06J says, it's C. Nadia Abdelaziz says, I don't know, maybe C. Laman Jagat says, I think B. Myra 789 off says, shut up Nightbot. Back and Gel Gamer says, B and C. Khan says, bro it's fucking CC the skull and she have wider shoulder see you blind bro what the sigma. Micah's Playhouse says, okay which one? Xking1325 says, I think C it's a T and I think it's because it is her husband and he is angry at her and she is sad. Yasser Mohammed says, welcome to Board Clipboard, any text that you copy will be saved here. Welcome to Board Clipboard, any text that you copy will be saved here. Welcome to Board Clipboard, any text that you copy will. Roberto Jimena FV4RV says, you. Arthur Ford Bolap says, what? Back and Gel Gamer says, C and B. Is Apro says, hookah. Roberto Jimena FV4RV says, you. Is Apro says, I'm done bro. Myra 789 off says, 1. Myra 789 off says, now. Chowanin says, CC. Sophia Pokemon says, hi, I am new, guess what, I'm going camping. Kiana Abazi says, C is correct. Joan Yabad says, C because of the shortness the pelvis bone and the shoulder. Elijah Zacchaeus Gaming says, it's C. Is Apro says, brew I will goon right now. Joan Yabad says, C because of the pelvis bone and the shoulder. 2DXD says, Caramel I think you forgot the Camel USA. Joan Yabad says, CC. Is Apro says, why row me? 2DXD says, I love gorillas. Aurelia Eliza says, I don't. Joan Yabad says, CCCCCCXCC. Kita Plays YT13 says, C is kid B is woman Anna is man. Not Skyline Edit says, BBL Latinas. Railroad Crossing Animations says, what? Ryshat U60 says, at is Apro laughing out loud. Joan Yabad says, the person with the smallest pelvis and the shortest thing is the woman CCCC. Broken Windmill says, hi. Is Apro says, ha. Broken Windmill says, hi. Keelan Hopkins M7I says, what the fudge is that sound? Life with Paris says, said hi. Titanic Sinking K8V says, 67. Miss Brew Plays says, Rizzler Sizzler. Not Skyline Edit says, 67. Astrox21 says, what is this? Ryshat U60 says, pigeon pigeon. Is Apro says, spam W is Apro for making you all smile. 2DXD says, guys does anyone know Lewis A here? Murata says, bro why Arione says that number. Ryshat U60 says, pigeon. Ryshat U60 says,
Kale's
pigeon.
vlog subscribed.
Benjanessa Benolacum says, not tough. Titanic Sinking K8V says, rest in peace my nan and cat. Quadgang49 says, rest in peace my granny she got hit by a bazooka. Miss Brew Plays says, Rizzler Sizzler. Bogut Nasisarwa said hi. Shaxnazer F4K cat orange whistling. Titanic sinking K8V Nightbot. Murata Limural Emma Joy, I bet they are 4th grade kids. Ivana T4F I think B. Admin Sigma Namoa Sadivan. Admin Sigma Joe Muck. 2DXD guys, anyone like gorillas here? Leighton Z1B Harbap Bap L2 Sarsway. Murata Limural bro, why Anishlovo's stream talking is talking something strange. King Cosmic 45 whoever is complaining. Murata Limural like his sound looks like kid. Simone Futura trophy yellow smiling. Sinamoral Loving Ice it's a guys. Aiden I2P9F hi guys. Arslan Random Guna. Jacob Games Z7Y CC. Noah Watson Z3S BB. Is Apro I know you'll goon admit it. Leighton Z1B please say this out loud 67 67 67 67 67 68 67 plus dollar. Gopher Koju XO. Arslan Random I goon twin. Raishat U60 everyone goons. Arslan Random you'll goon like me, don't lie y'all. Arslan Random yeah. Neslikert 66 BB. Is Apro guys, why you're copying what I'm saying? Is Apro don't copy my comments. Jizzly 27 said hi. Arslan Random I said, I goon, first and you copied it though. Raishat U60 oh sorry at Nightbot. The Funny Kids 5 67676767. Quaking Host BBB. Emilia Showman G7Q 67. Dennis Stefan 66666877777777888877. Jizzly 27 hello. Anish welcome to chat at Jizzly 27 welcome. Murata Limural for Anish Lovo Talker, if you're reading this, I bet your voice will give because of this word. Is Apro no bro, I said it like 15 minutes ago. Raishat U60 laughing out loud. Neslikert 66 it's B. Neslikert 66 it's B. Neslikert 66 it's AB. YT Phoenix said hi. Jizzly 27 face red heart shape, face red heart shape, face red heart shape, ice pink heart shape, ice pink heart shape. Dan Desold Lover M3Z stop spamming. Maheshasia Trinity Bliss. Agathamanani BBB. CHNGSNGPOH Mo CC. Maheshasia says, Morgan Dan, where are you? Face purple crying, face purple crying, face purple crying, face purple crying.